Joining us live from New York with more insight on the Cuban-U.S. relationship is Professor Ted Henken. And Professor, I know that you've been to Cuba more than a dozen times. You've even put together a document called Notes from the Underground as you describe restaurants and sites you've seen there. Use terms like classy, unique, friendly, helpful, unforgettable, romantic. And I think here in the West, it doesn't square with how it's viewed as a repressive Castro regime. Are people surprised when they hear about what you've discovered?
Well, I think you can have both. I mean, you can have a society that's rich in culture, people that are intelligent and think for themselves, services and especially private services where people stand to make a buck if they serve well and they do a professional job. You can have that at the same time as you can have a repressive government. So I don't think it's either or. People are surprised, but that surprise is often through ignorance because remember, Americans haven't been able to travel freely to Cuba for more than 50 years, and I really hope that that will change. There's no reason to repress American freedoms and rights to travel just because Cuba represses its own freedom. And actually, they have made steps recently to start to slowly change those things, especially regarding travel. A year ago, they made a major reform in their travel restrictions, and Cubans are now starting to travel around the world.
Professor, I'm sure you must have had some preconceptions before you went for the first time. What surprised you?
Well, one anecdote that's kind of funny is that, Americans, when they travel in Latin America, are often expecting to be called gringo or Yankee. In Cuba, they have their own word that is not a derogatory word for Americans and for foreigners, but usually they use it to refer to North Americans, and that is Yuma. They refer to the United States as La Yuma and to Americans as Yumas. And so it's kind of an affectionate term. And I was really also impressed and surprised that people were, when they discovered I was an American from the United States of America, they really wanted to talk to me. They became even more friendly instead of less friendly, which is exactly the opposite of what most media coverage would lead you to believe.
Ted, one of the things that I've heard from people who watch this closely is that given the pivotal role Florida plays in presidential elections every 4 years, of course, we know dating back to the Bush-Gore race, it was very pivotal. That's one of the reasons why you won't see Republicans or Democrats leaning towards engaging Cuba because it might miff people in Florida. Do you think that's the case, and how do you resolve that issue?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, most politicians only see the downside to touching the Cuba issue unless they're going to continue with the hard line. And so they really refuse to go there. They refuse to question our hard line. You've seen some signals from the Obama administration that have recognized publicly while Obama is meeting with dissidents, he says we need to kind of turn the page and we need to have a new policy. We can't have the same policy that was in place when Obama was a toddler. So there is some of that. You also have some important changes in Miami because recently Joe Garcia, a Democrat, was elected to Congress. And so now you have a Democrat who, even though he's critical of the Cuban government, is much more encouraging of the engagement, the people-to-people policy that the Obama administration has put out there in distinction to the Bush administration and in distinction to Marco Rubio and some of the other politicians who really stick to the hard line and criticize this opening that Obama is trying to make to try to move forward, engage. The handshake in South Africa was an example of that.
Well, Professor, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your insights. Certainly appreciate it. Professor Ted Henken joining us from New York this evening.